Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Habitat Podcast. I'm your host, Jared Van Hees, and we are back with another great episode for you guys tonight. Now, for anybody who hasn't listened before, the Habitat Podcast is the podcast for wildlife managers and everybody else trying to become better habitat managers. We're out there all the time improving our land and the land around us for the wildlife to benefit them. So, guys, today I have a special guest on the line, Mike Perry. Mike is from Pennsylvania. He hunts in PA and Ohio. And this is a pretty interesting episode. It's a little bit more scouting focused and deer bedding focused and how those both relate to what types of habitat there is out there on farm country, public land, swamps, wherever we all hunt. There's a way to relate the habitat to deer bedding and how to find it. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Funnels, big tracks, oxbows, and creek bends. Mike is a deer killer, a big buck killer, and is a very experienced scouter and is actually new to the food plot side of things. So we dive into that too, what his plans are with finally adding food to his regiment. So Mike Perry, PA, let's get into that here shortly. I want to thank our sponsor, Nick Percy at Killer Food Plots. I actually got my Border Patrol and smoke screen planted yesterday morning. Now, these are screening products. The Border Patrol I am using to screen my plot and break up my plot into a horseshoe shape and create some natural funnels with that screen. The smoke screen is also a screen, but I'm using it for access along my property line. The difference is the Border Patrol has some food in it and the smoke screen does not. So what that's going to do is allow me to get two different types of screen. I'm getting access to my stand, hiding my food plot from deer cruising 50 or 60 yards back in the woods. They won't be able to see across the whole thing, and they're going to have to come check out the food plot itself. So I got that planted yesterday. We have about until mid-July to plant that this year with how wet it is. I actually used my Packer Max to cultipack that in after I disked. And guys, it's a muddy mess out there, and the Packer still packed everything down super firm, gave these seeds a great seed bed. And there's enough moisture in the soil. I don't even think it needs to rain yet, but it's going to rain tonight actually. So I should be perfect on those. Then hopefully we get some heat and some, rain, and that's going to help those screens shoot up. So thank you to our sponsors there, Packer Max and Killer Food Plots, for allowing me to get that screen in. And next, guys, we have Michigan Whitetail Pursuit. We actually been posting some new videos recently, some bear hunts. So if you've ever been bear hunting and want to see a couple more real nice bears shot on film, check them out at MichiganWhitetailPursuit.com. There's also the Facebook group called The Michigan Whitetail Pursuit. There's about 3,000 members on there. It's very interactive. Lots of people posting up their buck kills and their turkey kills and everything else. And just a great group of people, producing, filming hunts for everybody to see. So now I want to touch on some of the great reviews we've been getting on iTunes recently. So thank you guys for doing that. We have Trump Cowley Outfitters. Keep up the great work. Lots of hunting podcasts out there, but I'm leaning in your direction lately due to your consistently high quality content and informative guests. Easy to listen to, just like I'm sitting around the fire with my buddies. Thank you, Trump Outfitters. We're going to get a decal sent out to you. I really appreciate it. And we have Decoy Hound, another user who left us a review. Always a good listen. Can't wait for the next one. It's surprising what you think you may know or don't know about habitat management. Whether you're a hardcore wannabe or just interested, the guests and topics are entertaining, diverse, and informative. When listening to each episode, you start to realize how each topic is somehow connected, even though it's not obvious at first. You learn that there are many solutions and alternatives out there and to get closer to your goals. I enjoy listening very much. Keep it going, Jared and Brian. Thanks. Thank you, Decoy Hound. I will get you a decal as well for leaving us that 5-star review. Guys, we have 101 ratings on there. Please go to your podcast app on your phone or Apple iTunes online and leave us a good review. Like I said, you get a free decal. So we appreciate your support on that, guys. And keep listening. We have a real nice couple episodes coming up, guys. You're going to love them. We have episode 49 and 50 coming up after this, and they are going to be some great ones, guys. Some of our best yet. So stay tuned. Big things to come for the Habitat Podcast. You can listen to us at habitatpodcast.com. And you know what? Without further ado, let's get Mike Perry from Pennsylvania on the line right now. And we're back, guys. Another episode of the Habitat Podcast. We have my co-host Brian Hallbly on the line, and our excited guest. I'm excited. His name is Mike Perry. Mike, how you doing?
Good. How about you guys?
Good, man. Thanks for coming on tonight.
No problem.
We
Glad to be here.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming on. We had some technical difficulties, so we're rolling now. Brian, you got Mike, or you got a hold of Mike. You guys are friends, right? From the same area, or how's that work?
Yeah, Pennsylvania. I've known of Mike for, gosh, got to be going on 10, 15 years through the United Bow Hunters of Pennsylvania. We both worked in different capacities for that organization over the years. And more recently, we've been able to get to meet each other in person. And he's been over to my farm a couple times. I've been down to his lease a couple times, and just really enjoy his friendship and sharing all our deer hunting stories.
Very nice. I appreciate you getting this scheduled. Mike, you mentioned you've been on a few other podcasts before, so this isn't your first time. That's good to hear. I'd like to, if you can, we usually start out with an introduction of the guests, who they are, where they're from. I always say paint a picture, kind of explain to the listeners who we're talking to. You mind going through that?
No problem. I live in Northwest Pennsylvania, in Waterford, Pennsylvania, and I work for a newspaper. I'm a supervisor for distribution, transportation, the drivers, and a load and dock foreman. And I've been hunting since I was 12 years old. I'm 53 now. I've been bow hunting since '86. Started bow hunting Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York in '87, '88. So I've been at it a long time. Learned through trial and error mostly. But
Wow.
yeah, I work third shift. I have two boys and a wife, and live out in the country. I own 20 acres, and we're starting to try to do a little bit of improvements here on that. I wish I would have started when I built this place in '94, but I'm a slow learner, I guess. So.
Well, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, the Habitat stuff probably wasn't maybe broadcasted as much back then. I'm sure it wasn't broadcasted as much back then, but were you aware of people talking about it as much back in '94?
No, and the thing of it is, when it came to, hunting Pennsylvania, for me, all the way up until antler restrictions, which were in early 2000s, I really just would go out and try to kill the first buck I could get, and I concentrated on my serious hunting on New York and Ohio, and especially Ohio, and I hunt a lot of public over in PA, and I just never really hunted that much right around my house here. And as my sons got of age of hunting, I started realizing that there's some pretty nice deer right behind my house. When I started setting up, getting things ready for them to hunt just close to the house. I didn't want to drag them 3/4 of a mile back into a swamp or anything, around here, and ruin them at an early age.
Right.
So I started setting up cameras back here, and started noticing that there's, not only a lot of deer, but there's some pretty nice deer around here. So now we're starting to try and, improve things here. I wish I would have started sooner. I have had it logged out a few times, and that has helped out because how that I have like 18 acres of woods, and that creates a lot of thick growth and a lot of bedding. The deer are in there. So
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, I think we do know what you're talking about with that logging and an open canopy. I mean, I think if there's one thing that we've talked about the most out of our almost 50 episodes, it's getting that sunlight to the forest floor. So definitely got you there. I actually signed a contract with a forester today, so I'm gonna try doing that even more on the back part of my property. So now on your 20 acres, was it hard to find a forester, maybe not a forester, but a logger to come in there for a good price? Or did you have a lot of high value stuff in there, or what was it?
Um, no, well, it's definitely not hard in this area. There's a lot of logging that goes on, so I just got three bids each time. I had a forester come when I first bought the property. I originally bought 3 acres in '93 to build the house, and my grandmother owned this farm. That's how I got involved in hunting when I was a kid. I grew up in the city, and we would come out here on the weekends. And my grandpa got me into hunting. He took me out, my grandpa and my uncles, and started out that way. And after my grandfather passed away in '84, I was on my own. I started getting into bow hunting and all that, and so I bought that property, the first 3 acres in like '93, built the house, and then in '96 or '7, my grandmother sold me the additional 17 acres right behind my three. So yeah, there's this whole, it's pretty forested around here. I mean, it's farmland, but there's a lot of forest. There's not a lot of small woodlots. It's usually big woodlots with fields all interspersed around the squares. So
Okay, so is it fairly hilly? Is there some topography in your area, or?
right here at the house, it's a little bit of rolling hills. It's mostly flat. I live in not too far from a river, and so I'm not too far from where all the flat land is. There is some topography changes, but not a lot. It's not as flat as Ohio where I hunt at, which is about 40-50 miles to the west of where I live. That's pretty much all flat over there where Brian's farm's at and where I hunt at. But around here, there is some topography. There's no big hills, but you have your gullies and your ravines and stuff like that. So
Okay, so you hunt over by Brian's farm too. Okay, now,
yeah, I'm about 4 miles from him or so.
oh geez, that's close. Um,
hmm
Now you've been hunting for, if I did my math right, was it 40 years?
Well, yeah, 41 years I've been hunting, but I've been into and deer hunting since I was 16. So 36, 37, whatever, and then I've been bow hunting pretty. I got into it pretty hard in when I was 21. So 32 years of hardcore deer hunting, basically.
Okay, so when do you think for you in your past you went to the full-blown addiction, like like Brian and I and yourself, like we all have? When did you cross that line? And there's a lot of time that coincides with chasing an older deer, but maybe it doesn't with you. I'm just curious. When was that?
This was 1986. It was the first year I bow hunted, and I actually back then, Pennsylvania, stump jumpers. Your tree stands were, a wooden stand built into the side of a tree, and I had a stand across the road from my grandmother's farm, and I got up in there with a bow, and it was like the first or second time I was up in that stand, and I had a buck near an archery come in within 12 yards, I think it was, and I could not even draw my bow back. I mean, the arrow kept coming off the rest, trying to draw on them. I never felt nothing like it. I had shot a few deer with a gun before that, but this was just unbelievable. So I just couldn't get enough of it. I didn't kill anything that first year, but then in '87, I shot a buck, an 8-point on the first day of archery, and then I ended up buying an Ohio license because I wanted to keep bow hunting. And
Oh,
next thing I knew,
nice.
I was hunting New York, and then I was just hunting every day of the season for years and years and years in 3 states, and whatever state I'd travel to. Every once in a while, I'd go on a trip somewhere, but usually just for turkey. But I'd deer hunt too, other states, but never killed much in the other states. But that was, back then. I haven't been deer hunting in another state for a while, other than Ohio and PA.
Okay, so Mike, I have to ask, what's a stump jumper?
That's just Pennsylvania. There's a guy behind every tree, so you sit on a stump. You get your little, your little thermoset thing and clipped onto your belt back in the day, and you'd sit on the stump and you'd move around, and that's what you. That's how we hunted back then. That's gun season in PA.
Hey man,
Largest armed militia in the United States.
I love it. I've talked to a lot of deer hunters, and the last I don't know how many years, but I've never heard that term, so I had to ask. I had to
Well,
ask.
that's what the guys in New York always called us. We'd come up there and they just couldn't stand it because we'd come up there during gun season and shoot all the deer. I mean, what we had tags for, but they just would shake their heads. They called us stump jumpers. They didn't like us too much. We were shooting their deer as far as they were concerned. So
Now, Mike, we'd like to tie this into the habitat portion of it for some of our
Okay.
listeners.
Yep.
And what type of habitat are you hunting up there around the house in Pennsylvania? And then you can go into your places you hunt in Ohio also. What kind of habitat are we talking about?
now around here, like I said, it is a farming community. There's a lot of farmland. I have permission from a lot of farmers around here. But I mainly hunt the public land, which are the big swamps. It always seems to be, at least in the area I live in, the swamps end up becoming the public land. However they end up acquiring it, end up being stuff that isn't real tillable land. So I'm hunting a lot of swamps, beaver dams, creek systems, oxbow lakes in them, stuff like that. That's what I hunt mainly in Pennsylvania. In Ohio, it's mostly farmland with, good sized chunks of timber, but a lot of ag and, flatter area, which over here, like I said, we'll get some gullies and ravines and stuff, but nothing real steep in elevation differences.
Right. So if somebody owns a property like that, walk us through, talk about the oxbows and other features that you're looking for when you're going out there to scout in the spring.
Okay, well, on the public around here, I'm looking to we get quite a bit of pressure. I think I heard that Pennsylvania has the most bow hunters per square mile. I was just heard that somewhere before. So when you're going to hunt public around here, you have to get away from the guys because that's where the deer are going to be, especially the bigger bucks. So I'm looking to I'm always looking for water. I use water as a barrier. For whatever reason, most guys don't like crossing water. They don't like going too far from the trucks. I know that's the cliche, but that it does seem to be true. The further you get away from people, and if you have to, cross some water, go through a beaver dam, you're going to be back there by yourself most of the time. I usually hunt in hip waders or chest waders, depending on how much rain we get. But I hunt in hip waders almost always in Pennsylvania on public land, and that keeps me away from the crowds.
You actually sit in the hip waders?
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I've done it forever. Yeah. So I'm just used to it. One year I was after a buck. There was a big one, 173. The buck ended up scoring it. Someone ended up killing it that I knew during gun, but I wanted that buck bad, and I had that. And it rained so much, I had to go around 1.75 miles, crossing all these beaver dams and creeks and everything that I could get to. I couldn't get across the creek that I wanted to get across to hunt this buck, but I had to wear chest waders and walk through water, belly deep in the dark. And I did it for, the whole rut trying to kill that buck. So I hunted in chest waders every day, neoprene chest waders. So it wasn't so bad. I wasn't cold, but yeah, it was a hassle, but I guess I'm just crazy that way.
Yeah, buddy.
Now, what do you find that the mature bucks like back in that kind of habitat?
Well, they just like the thickets. They just want to be away from the people, and the does are going to be back there. I mean, you just got to find a food source close to the bedding and get on that first food source. Find the scrapes that are closest to the bedding, and I just try to. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, hunting close to bedding areas, and back in the 90s and late 80s, that was taboo. Everybody told you, oh, you can't go into the bedroom, and right. they'd be sitting on the way outside of it. But
sure.
I just noticed, a long time ago that the closer you get into the bedding, the better. And it's hard to say exactly what they like. I mean, when you get back in these swamps and some of these big swamps, it's just thick everywhere. So you just look for any kind of transition you can find. So just different timber, brush lines along the creeks. I like hunting, looking for funnels and find something where there's a beaver dam, and the deer usually are going to parallel those beaver dams when they travel. And if you can find a beaver dam that has, an oxbow lake coming up next to it, or, a stream or river coming up next to it, creates a funnel. And that's usually where I'll be hunting at, something like that. There's a lot of oxbow lakes in some of these places I hunt, which are, how a meandering creek will, over time, has a lot of bends in it, and over time, when you get a flood, it'll change the course of the creek or the river,
Sure.
and it'll leave that section of, say there used to be a big loop in the river. Well, then, it'll flood over that, and then it'll change the course, and then it'll leave that whole section, which used to be the creek, full of standing water. And the deer really, when those dry up, they pound scrapes all through there. But when they fill up with water, then they just parallel them. But I try to use stuff like that to my advantage, get water on both sides of me and find a funnel going through that. And a lot of that you can't really see from an aerial photo. You got to get in there and walk around and find it, So I'm in there looking for big tracks and, buck sign, but, I'm not as much concerned with, rubs as I am, and rubs or scrapes for that matter. If there's good trails in there and there's does in there and it's thick and there's some food, there's going to be big bucks moving through there in November for sure. So, I don't know if you want me to go through the whole thing that I do. When I find these areas and I scout them out, and I try to find what I think are going to be good funnel areas, and then I'll put cameras in there. I didn't back in the day. I've been using cameras since like '02, but back then I didn't have that advantage. But nowadays it makes it a lot easier because I can put a camera in there, and I can monitor it without even hunting it. I have so many different spots that I go to that I'll find a couple new spots every year, and I'll just put cameras out and let them sit there and just soak the whole season. And then right before gun, I'll go in there and take them down so they don't get stolen, because during gun, someone might end up finding them. And if I got, pictures of does going through on a regular basis, and I know there's doe bedding by, that's why I put the camera there, because I found the bedding areas. And I know there's does regularly going through, and then I see that there's mature bucks cruising through there during daylight, and that the cameras are still gone. No one stole them. I ain't getting pictures of guys, and I know that I can go back there in the rut. I don't even have to touch that spot until November, and that's when I'll go in late October, early November, and I'll go in there and I'll sit all day long. And when I shoot the bucks, it's usually, mid-morning, midday, something like that.
Okay. So you're basically keying in on them during that breeding period.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other times, cold fronts or anything else you pay attention to that might get you in on them earlier?
Well, nowadays, I have been doing that more often. I will go in October if I got a good spot and there's a cold front and hunt it, if I got good access in the wind and everything's good. And, but, I only started doing that the last, 5 or 6 years when I started, reading and getting involved with guys on the hunting beast and about, these guys that are hunting buck beds. I mean, I'm not a buck bed hunter per se. I try it. It's just, these guys are good, because it's hard to get in on a close on a buck bed. And there's guys that do it every year, but, they're bedded in that spot for a reason, because it's, pretty much rock solid, so yeah. I spent most of my earlier years of bow hunting shooting does in October, and I would fill my doe tags in October. I don't do that anymore, but now I've been trying to do that when you get a cold front, get in there in October and try to get in on some buck beds that I know about, but it hasn't worked out for me yet. But working third shift, it's tough for me to do. I hunt mobile all the time in Pennsylvania on the public land, and it's real hard to when you have to be to work at 8:30 at night. It's getting dark at 7. To go in there and getting set up part I can do, but getting torn down quietly and getting out of there and then driving 23 miles to work, it just doesn't work out for me. So it's just tough for me to hunt buck bedding in October.
Sure.
So that's why I like to key in on hunting in a rut more than anything. I concentrate on does then.
Okay. Well, can't argue with the success that you've had. I don't blame you. I mean, I've been studying the beast tactics since you got me involved in it, and I believe a lot of it helped me kill that fucking PA this year. I used a lot of the tactics I learned from those guys, so it definitely works. But
Mm-hmm.
argue with what you've been doing. It's a good technique that you're using through that time of year. And why don't you tell us a little bit about that hunt you had last year on that big Ohio buck?
Okay, that's on a property that me and 3 friends lease. It's 500 acres. I had been hunting that spot since the late 90s. It was always just a permission farm I had. It was pounded with hunters, and a couple years ago, a few other guys approached the farmer and asked if he would lease the property to him. And he said, well, the condition is you have to let Mike on it. So, I was grateful for that. I mean, I really didn't want to have to pay to hunt, but, it is what it is. And I was grateful that they let me on. They became good friends of mine. And then they ended up getting out of it last year. And the farmer wanted me to find a couple other guys. So I did that. So I have a lot of history with this farm is what I'm getting at. And that buck in particular, I had been getting pictures of him since 2012 when I believed he was 2.5. The EHD had hit that farm hard that year, and there was very few deer left after the EHD. Like, I was guessing 70%. I mean, I found 19 deer myself dead. And anyhow, this buck, I called him Boss Hog. I didn't hunt him until 2014 when he was 4.5. There was a couple other guys that were on the farm, like I said, that were hunting them. We had a lot of history with them. And when those guys got off the lease, I knew that I was going to probably have the best chance at them because the 3 guys I brought on hadn't really ever hunted there before. I was trying to help those guys out, and I was setting up stands for everybody to hunt out of, in before the season. And what I kind of did was I just kind of we just soaked the place with trail cameras. So I kind of gridded out there's 250 acres on each side of the road. And I set everything up so I could go in there and hunt when my vacation started at the end of October and be able to hit 3 or 4 cameras and go in and hunt a stand, either a stand I already had pre-hung or else I'd go in with my lone wolf, sticks and stand. And that was my tactic. I went in there the first week of November, last couple of days of October, first week of November, and I hopped around on both sides of the road. There was 2 bucks I was after. The one I had found both sheds from the year before, he was like a 147 that year. I called Shorty, and then he was on the one side of the road, and his buck Boss Hog was on the other side of the road. It was funny how that Boss Hog buck, all the years we never got pictures of him on the other side of the road. At least I never did. So basically what I did was I just grid hunted it, the first 7-8 days. I just hopped around in different sections of the farm so that I wasn't putting too much pressure, and I was able to check 3 or 4 cameras each time. And then I was taking that data and going, okay, he was here on this day, he was here on this day, he's traveling this direction, he was going on this wind, and just kind of putting the pieces together, and finally moved in there on the 4th of November. Noticed that he had been the last couple years transitioning. The way he liked to walk was north-south, and there was a trail that went from the northwest down to the southeast towards the creek. I knew of a few places where he bedded at, and I figured that trail would be the best trail that I'd have a chance to kill him on, and it just so happened that it worked out that way. In fact, I took you to that spot, Brian. That's where you came with me to look for that buck from the year before, that 11 point.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so that tree is the tree I shot that buck out of.
Okay.
Now, Mike, how big was that buck? How big that buck ended up being? How old?
He was 8.5 years old.
Oh, baby.
He field dressed 200 pounds even. And he was 161, 162, right around there, that area.
Congratulations, first of all.
Hey, thank you.
Second of all, what type of specific habitat is that buck bedding in? And what type of habitat do you find the other bucks in PA or wherever you're scouting a lot? What specific habitat is that thicket You know, what's that made out of? Like, what are you finding that these deer are bedding in?
Well, they're bedding in a lot of just thick brush on the edges of creeks for the most part. Is that buck would bed on the edge of a beaver dam in some little bit more open woods on this knoll, and he could watch down over the beaver dam. He could see anything coming to him, and the wind was coming out from off the other property when he would bed there, so he could smell anybody coming from behind, and he could watch. So yeah, but he had 3 or 4 beds that I know of were his in there. It's just it's a lot of swamp white oak in there, and there's a lot of just real thick, nasty multiflora rose. I mean, it's just
Okay.
thick. It's just so I can't give you the exact
No, that's
type
okay.
of, but that's.
Well, and it's more of the feature as well, which seems to be water in a lot of these spots.
Mhm.
Water
Mhm.
and thick cover. I mean, we can relate to that here in Michigan. I tell you what, I've hunted public land for my entire life. Shot my first deer on public land, the whole thing. And what I've learned, it may have taken me a while, but I've learned that the thicker it gets, the better it gets. Like, and usually in Michigan that means a swamp. Um, and and I mean most of the time I don't even need my gun during gun season. It's usually when we hunt public is gun season, but I could shoot them all with my bow because I'm only in 30-yard openings or 20-yard openings, and it seems to be thick brush along a water feature. So I just was
Mhm.
curious what you had to say
And
about that.
and a lot of times, when you do have like at that farm, for instance, you have some swamp white oaks, so it gets a little bit, I wouldn't say open, but you can see a little further. I mean, because a lot of it you can't see 10, 15 yards,
Yep.
but they usually like the bed somewhere where they can see a little ways, and they'll sit on the edge of that, and they'll have the wind coming over their back from the thicker stuff behind them, and then watch out in front of them. So.
Okay. Um, is there any other sort of terrain feature or habitat feature, whether it's a stand of oaks or a clear cut or anything else that you look for when you're scouting either a private or public farm?
Yeah, definitely like hunting clear cuts too, on the edges of clear cuts. That farm there, also on the one side of the road where that buck Shorty was, I had found both of his sheds, and the one he was bedding 100 yards off of a cornfield. Some years it's corn, some years it's beans, but and there's a little ridge right there, and it was all a lot of mature trees in there, but right there it had been selectively cut about 4 or 5 years ago, so there was a real thick snag right in there, and his one shed was laying in his bed right in there, and then the other
Nice.
one was in the on the edge of the clear cut, and they would bed on that clear cut, and the clear cut ran in the whole length of the property, north south, and then it was to the west of our property. So when there was a west wind, those deer would bed on that east side of that clear cut and look out into that where them oaks are. There's a lot of real nice mature oaks in there, and it had been selectively cut, so there was pockets of thicket in that 250, but in that 250 acres. But they would bed on the edge of that clear cut, and then they'd watch out, and then they'd go right into them oaks and feed. First ones right off the bat. Uh, Passed up some real nice bucks the first few days I hunted this year on the edge of that clear cut. I had went in there and mapped out where all the trails coming out of there using the Onyx mapping.
Yeah.
I like that. I mean, back in the day, I would take surveyor tape and I'd walk all the deer trails and mark it so I could figure out which way everything was going. But now I will put them on that mapping on Onyx. And I'll just walk up and down the trails in the March, when all the there's no leaf cover,
Right.
and map it all out that way. Now you can get a bird's eye view of it. Makes it a little easier.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Good point.
Now when you're dealing with these clear cuts, are you finding that they're bedding in them or feeding in them, going to them for a destination food source, or both, or what are you finding?
Well, they're doing all the above, but they do like the bed in those clear cuts. And the thing about clear cuts, at least the ones that I've dealt with, is they don't bed like in the middle of the clear cut, or at least that's not what I find. I find most of the beds are on the perimeters of the clear cut within 100 yards and in towards the mature timber or field or whatever happens to be on the outside of them. So they're most of the good bedding is on the edge of it.
So the first
Right on
100
that
yards of the clear
transition.
cut.
Yeah,
Okay. The
yeah,
transition.
more so even the first like 30 to 50 yards. But yeah, they don't go. I've been in some big clear cuts, and usually, you know, how thick they can be and
Oh
nasty
yeah.
and multiflora rows and all that. They'll be bedding in the middle of it, but unless there's a lot of pressure, I don't think they're going to be bed right in the middle of it. They're
Okay.
usually on the edges of it. I think those
And
are like wind specific beds, so that they're sitting there on certain winds, so that they can watch the opening.
right.
So
And
that's
and
where they're
just
going.
and for anybody who doesn't know what Mike's referring to, a buck will bed with the wind at his back. So say you have a clear cut to the east and open hardwoods to the west. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike. He'll bed on that transition with the east wind coming through the clear cut behind him, and he'll look to the west, downwind,
Exactly. Yes.
downwind, so he can see what's coming and also smell what's coming on the other side of him, on his backside.
Yep.
So,
Exactly.
so I want to make sure I hit that in case you have some listeners who weren't aware of that quite yet. So the deer can cover both sides when he's bedded. Now, do you find the same way in a swamp, like Dan Infalt talks about? It's still that transition line. Uh, they don't necessarily bed, I guess, all the time on that transition line in a swamp, but that's where he scouts. What do you find as a commonality between the swamp and the clear cut?
Well, yeah, the swamp it is the same thing because well, at least I mean, not always, but yeah, you're especially down along the edges of a beaver dam, for instance. If you notice, you say you have a big beaver dam that will like hold ducks. It's got water on it. That first, at least where I'm hunting at, that first 20, 30, 40 yards off of that water is usually really, really thick. Dogwood and stuff like
Oh
that's
yeah.
going through and then, as it, because it's lower there, and then it gradually starts going up, and then you'll start having, whether it's logged or not or whatever, you have more open woods. And, a lot of times they're bedded right off of that, they're right
Okay.
in there. And that's where you'll find, the clusters of rubs and, the rub lines start coming out of there. And that's the stuff that, if you can get in there and hunt it, that's where you want to be. You want to
Okay.
get down as close as you can to that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I'm trying to just put a couple things together between all these different areas that you hunt that might all be in common. And it seems to be that you're on the edge of a bedding area.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you start.
Yep.
The downwind side of a bedding area, I'm guessing.
Yep.
And go from there. Okay.
Yeah, and like a lot of my hunting is in bedding, and a lot of bedding is on a transition line, and it could be any kind of transition line. You know what I mean? So there's a
What else is
lot
there
of
that we
different
haven't
things that
hit
make a
yet?
transition line. It could be a field. It could be, you guys know. I mean,
Yep.
it could be hemlocks. It just different changes in habitat. And thank God I read an article about that back in the late 80s or something, and it was one of the few things that you have to sift through the tea leaves when you're reading hunting articles, because a lot of stuff people just write sounds good in theory, but it doesn't actually work.
Yeah.
So you have to go out and see what works and what doesn't work. Yeah, I read everything from rattling works to which I'm sure in a lot of places it does, not in Pennsylvania and on public land it don't, but so it's just I figured out a long time ago that hunting any type of transition where the more habitats that come together, the better. So say you got 3 different things coming together, then that's better than 2. And that's where the deer spend their time. That's where they travel. That's where they, in my opinion, rut. That's where the bucks cruise for does. That's where the does are bedding, and
Okay.
that's where I'm trying to hunt.
No, I like it. I had one more question on that, but it's slipping my mind now. Um, I mean, yeah, I find beds, in my clover on the edge of a pine thicket or wherever. And there might be summer beds versus, you know, in the fall when it gets a little more pressure, but that's interesting.
No, yeah, you find, I mean, you find beds just, on edges of fields a lot of times too, but, you got to watch, sometimes that's where they're laying their chewing their cud at night, but,
Yep.
you just got to be able to, kind of figure out what's what. I mean, it just comes with experience, and the more, scouting you do, the, you'll everyone figures it out. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of big bucks will bed right on the edge of a field,
Well,
especially in Ohio. That happens a lot. At
Yeah.
Brian's farm, for instance, he has some great buck bedding watching his food plots. I mean, just inside, 20 yards in, and they know when you're there, you know what I mean? And
Unfortunately.
that's the hard part. That's the hard part
Right.
about hunting flatland,
Well, that's actually what I was going to ask you that I had just forgot. On the flatland, I hunt flatland where my property is. I find that they'll bed on the edge of a new hinge cut I made. Maybe not even in it quite yet because I don't think the pressure is very high right now, but on the edge of it, right where that edge is, that deer like edge, right? They're edge creatures, and right on the edge of the bed, or like you said, a field edge. It's kind of rolling perfect right into the next segment here. What did you see on Brian's farm specifically with his habitat that Brian learned from? Or when you guys walked it and you saw, your take on how to hunt. Well, first let's start, like, where were they bedded that you guys found? How far off of the food plot? What were they bedding in, etc.? Let's try to keep this bedding thing rolling here.
Okay. When I walked it, I noticed right away that they were bedding off of his main field. That he used to have an ag. That now I know he's transitioning all that over right now and bringing a lot of it back to new growth and that. They were bedding on the edge of that, but Brian has a lot of hinges in there and clearings that he made, and I noticed that they were definitely traveling in between those areas pretty good. So basically, let's just say, for instance, he had a clearing on the left and a clearing on the right, and wasn't so clear in the middle. I mean, that's where there was some pretty good runways going through that stuff. They were bedding on the edge of he has a couple what do you call it, the term you guys call a kill plot or whatever. There was some good bedding on that, but what I noticed the most was on the back part of this farm, would be I think the north side. Is that right, Brian? Is that the north side?
That's
yeah.
correct.
On the north side, he has some really thick. It looks like it was all clear cut at one time, however many years ago, and they were really bedding on the edge of that. And he has, some food plots back there that are hidden, from sight that no one would be able to see. And I think the deer really like that. That was just, it was just. There was big beds all through there, and there was big rubs all through there, and there's definitely some big bucks spending some time in there. The only bad thing about that is there's behind it, there's another however many 100 acres of clear cut, so it makes it tough,
Right.
Yeah, no, these things know how to avoid us, that's for darn sure.
Oh yeah.
Now, with that first part you mentioned on Brian's farm, and kind of what I'm creating as well, when you have two clear-cut areas or open areas or hinge-cut areas, whatever you end up doing, and you have that transition in between, is that a spot you would set up to hunt? And if
Yeah,
so,
that's what I was telling him.
how do you get there?
Finish your thought.
No, you're there. My thought was, how do you, if they see you, or if they're, it's open to where he parks. I'm picturing his farm because I've seen it, and I'm picturing mine the same way. How do you get in there without busting them out of their bed if they're bedded on the edge of the cut, or they're bedded at the edge of the field, his front field, for instance? How do you get in there, and would you hunt that?
That is the $1 million question. and the thing of it is yeah, I mean, that's the tough part. I would hunt there. I would hunt that, but I would, basically obviously the north end and the back where the hidden food plots are. I mean, that would be my first choice to hunt.
Sure.
Back there. But in between that, between his what used to be his 10-acre crop field or whatever size it was, and that back corner, there's quite a bit of good looking stuff in there. What I would suggest with his place is I would go down that. He has like a. I don't want to give away too much stuff here because I know people are always fishing on. And trust me, I've had people all over, calling me up, telling me they know where my stands are. They've seen my cameras and everything else.
Yeah.
When I started doing these podcasts, but anyhow, he has like a. I don't know. You call it a right of way or power line or whatever you want to call it. I would get up on that other side of that and come in. He'd have to wait for. But the nice thing about his farm is it should hunt good for that area with the predominant wind because, his farm is basically on the east side. So he with a west wind or a north wind or a northwest or a southwest, he should be able to get up on that other, be able to more or less say hunt the middle of that,
because he
not be
has
detected.
an east side access.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
Yep.
That's the best thing about his farm because I've found a lot of places over the years that look like they're going to be a great farm to hunt, but it's totally wrong. Side of it, it's all on the west side of the square. You can't.
Sure.
It's almost impossible. And you can hunt it in the mornings. When the thermals are rising.
Right.
A lot of times, and I think that's a lot of times why I shoot bucks in bedding areas early in the morning. And that buck I killed this year, or this past season in Ohio, that buck came in straight downwind to me. I knew I was hunting him with a wind blowing straight at him, but I knew that in the morning after there was a high pressure moving in after a low, and there was all that rain, and we had that wind was doing that switch around where you get that east wind when the front's coming out. And I was just hoping that when that sun comes up in the morning, as soon as it starts hitting the ground, that the milkweed would float, and it did. And and he came straight in downwind. And so that's something that I don't know a lot of people think about. Sometimes I think that guys that are using, say an ozone machine or whatever, they think that these deer are coming in downwind because of that. But a lot of times I think that it's just the thermals happen to be rising at that point, and that's what's going on, And in the mornings, a lot of times you can get rising thermals especially when you got a high pressure.
Yep.
And you have, a more open area and you have a lot of sunlight hitting the ground. It's just like fog, fog lifts when the sun comes out. Same thing, whether there's fog or not, your scent's going to rise up on that high pressure with it when that sun's hitting the ground. So.
Yeah, so talk about that a little bit, Mike. Go into a little bit of detail about the thermals. Are they you see the same consistency with flat ground and rolling ground when it comes to thermals? Just give our listeners a quick 101 on people.
Well, it's definitely flat ground's is definitely more consistent in my opinion. The more hills and ravines and trees and openings that you throw into things, then the more the wind switches around. So you can select your stands by trying to find places where you're going to have a consistent wind, or a consistent thermal. That just goes, with time. You learn these spots, and when you find them, those you be your go-tos. I like to set up near water, like for instance, in a beaver dam where you have, a big, say swamp. I have one spot in Ohio. I shot a couple of Pope and Youngs at that same farm, out of this one funnel, and on the one side, it's a bend in a creek, and on the other side of the funnel, just 25 yards away, it's 25 yards wide, there's a swamp that will hold like ducks in it, and there's bedding on both sides. There's a clear cut on the one side to the north, and then to the south, it's just like oaks and bigger timber, and if you set up on that water, on the edge of that, if you put your stand right on the edge of that water, as that water heats up, throughout the day, when in the evening, when the wind dies down, because it happens pretty much all the time in the evening, your wind, starts going down to nothing. You'll see, even if the wind was, say, coming out of the west, and I'm set up on the edge of that creek, like a slow moving creek that the water, it's not a rushing creek like a trout stream, but like a slow moving creek that has beaver dams going through it that makes it move slow. That water will heat up, and then your thermals will pull back towards that water. Now, if you would be set up on the other side, of that, say you didn't have water on both sides and you set up on the other side of that trail on that funnel, because you got a west wind, so you think you need to be on the east side of that trail. Well, that might be good all day long, but in the evening, when everything dies down, your scent's going to pull right back across that trail, so you better shoot the buck before he walks through, downwind of you, because he's going to smell you. And because it's still that your scent's going to be just like wafting all through down there, basically. That's why you want to get set up next to that water. But yeah, that's how I use thermals on flat ground or in the swamp, or like I said, I don't hunt a lot of topography, so I don't know. I can't tell you much about hill country, or
Right. Now, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see guys making, or maybe some mistakes that you learned from? I know we talked about the thing that I struggle with, not getting aggressive enough at the right time, and I'm working on that, and I'm hoping to get a little better at that this year. I got a little better last year. What kind of stuff have you learned from your mistakes, or what do you see guys doing wrong that they could change pretty easily?
Well, one thing that a lot of hunters seem to mistake, they go, and what they do is they go out and they go scouting a couple of weeks before the season, and they find scrapes and rubs, and instead of asking themselves, why are they here? When were they here? For what reason? When was this sign made? Instead of taking into consideration that deer, especially mature bucks, spend most of their time bedded or else walking at nighttime, that this sign was probably not made when I can kill this deer. They just go and set up a stand there, and then they wonder why nothing shows up, or why they're only seeing 6 points. They're just not thinking things through enough. They're finding the first hot sign or good sign that they consider good sign, and they're setting up there. Because I did that when I was younger. I mean, I just I'd start reading articles when I didn't know nothing about bow hunting, and oh my God, I got to find rubs and scrapes. I got to go run over and find oh, there's a rub. There's another rub. He's coming through here. There's a scrape. And set up a stand, and I'm 20 feet off of a field. On public land or something. It's just like, it ain't gonna happen. You have to. So that's definitely one of the things, and not being aggressive enough. I mean, I've had times where in the past where I haven't been aggressive, but I've becoming more and more aggressive over the years. I've had good luck killing specific mature bucks. The last couple years in Ohio, I've shot 5.5-year-old and 8.5-year-old buck, and by being aggressive, hunting on the wrong wind for that buck last year. That buck I called Super Freak with the drop times that I shot in 2016, that was 5.5 years old. I hunted that buck for 6 or 7 days in a row. Everyone says don't go to the same place. Well, you find a feeder creek that you can walk down through, and you don't step on a leaf, and you hunt it with the right wind. And
Bulletproof access.
And you can go in there every single day, and they don't know. I saw that buck 3 days out of 6. I knew that he was going through that area from previous history, like I said, I do with the cameras, and I knew that between the 6th of November and the 12th of November, he frequented that area in daylight, and the only time all year that he did frequent that farm in daylight. And I went in there that time frame, and I saw him 3 out of 6 hunts, and shot him on the last hunt, and I had 3 Pope and Youngs that day. I shot that buck that were chasing does around underneath me when I shot him.
So, Mike, I want to hear that story at some point, but you kind of got me thinking about something here. The scouting. So, scouting is super important. We talked about that in our last episode, and a lot of people, including myself and what sounds like you, scout as soon as deer season's over, maybe as soon as the snow melts, etc. But if we want to relate to some of the listeners right now, mid-June, what are you doing in spring, summer, fall to get ready for this year? And that may include, your new food plots we're talking about. What are you looking for? How are you determining where you're going to be this fall?
Well, I run my cameras all year long. And so right now, a lot of my scouting involves, my trail cameras. Like you said, I have been working on food plots this year, and that's more or less for my boys to hunt. But as far as for my hunting in the summertime, I've traditionally, years ago before there was cameras, I would sit on fields in glass, fields and stuff like that, drive around, look for deer. Now I know where I'm gonna, the properties or the swamps or the public that I'm gonna hunt. So I don't really go in there in the summertime, other than I have cameras in there running, and I'll check them every like 4 weeks. And any cameras that may be near where I might set, in a stand, those are in a tree. And cameras that are closer access are going to be on, down at eye level, say on a bean field, or on a mineral site in Ohio, or stuff like that.
Okay, so a lot of
once the
camera
apples
scouting.
start dropping, I got cameras and apples. That's what I do in the summertime. I try to get my inventory on the cameras that I can get at without bothering anything. The cameras that are further back towards bedding, I won't check those very often. I'll check them a couple times, and that's it. I don't need to. I just want to know, if they're going to be moving, when they're moving through there, and if they're moving through there. Try to get any kind of pattern. I don't feel that a lot of people say that there's no sense in running cameras all year, but I think that it's good to find any. There's always a pattern with a deer. They're gonna have some sort of pattern. So
Yeah.
it can't never hurt. And we're not the only predators that deer have. So they're being chased by whatever, just on everyday life. Bear, a coyote, whatever it is, so there if you can find a pattern, even if it's in the summertime, it might come useful, when it comes hunting season. So
Yeah, no, I mean, I learned about my property. It doesn't do much at all during the spring and summer besides house a doe family or two.
hmm
There are no bucks in there after the real cold sets in. There's not enough food directly in my area. They move on.
yep.
And I learned that through having a camera there all year long. But now, to your point about having the cameras all summer, now what do you take from that? Say you find, because a lot of these patterns will change come end of August, September 1st, somewhere in there. A lot of bucks will move, some won't. You're probably inventorying on what will stay and what will not, correct?
Exactly. What I'm looking for is the home bodies, because
Okay.
I'm hunting home body bucks. Those are the best ones. Those are the ones you build up years of history with. I mean, you get Roman bucks that you can build up years of history with too, but you'd have to be
Harder to
there
kill
on the
them.
day they show up,
Yeah.
and they usually will show up around the same time frame, because I think that the does are coming in the heat in that same time frame, and they know these doe groups after they're 4, 5, 6 years old. Which okay, these does were ready, this date. So I'm going to be there October 20th, or whatever, you know what I mean? So,
Yep.
but yeah, I want to know what the home bodies are doing. And I want to know, if there are any Roman bucks that happen to just show up, because you will get that too in the summertime. They're usually bachelor grouped up, but
Yeah.
not always. Some bucks will be loners, and they don't want to be around other bucks. You find that too over the untold thousands of pictures. I mean, last year I had 364 gig cards full of trail camera
Dang.
pictures. So
Holy cow.
and that, those compact flash at that's the ones I keep. Some of them, if there's nothing good on there, I just trash them. But I save
Right.
everything. So
So if you were one of our listeners right now and you were just getting your cameras set out um, for the summer into the fall, I know you mentioned field edge and some apples and this and that. Would you do some sort of a, a grid fashion, maybe over some mineral? I know mineral kind of fades off, but where would you start just for an easy first go-to for the listeners?
well,
Maybe a water hole even? I don't know.
well, I don't really put them on water. Water isn't a problem around here. It doesn't ever seem to stop raining.
Nowhere this year,
But
yeah.
yeah, exactly. But I noticed that bean fields, alfalfa fields really are good for getting inventory this time of the year. I try to put them on the edge of the field or just inside the field. If there's some apple trees just inside the field, I'm going to put them there. Usually, I'm going to put them in the lower spots. I'll walk the field edges and look for tracks and try to find where the bigger tracks are coming out into the fields. And usually, it's in the low spots, because when
That's a
it
great
cools
point.
down in the evening, the thermals drop down in those low spots in the fields, and you usually notice that the deer come up in low spots in the field. So that's a good place to start. Walk the edge of the field, look for big tracks. Or you see a bachelor group of bucks coming out, you can tell by the tracks, after a rain, and get your camera up. Usually it's going to probably be in some sort of low spot, but if not, I'm putting them in apple orchards. I'll go out every once in a while, and I shouldn't say every once in a while. Every summer I'll go out and I'll look for acorns up in trees with binoculars, and then I'll get cameras in areas where there's oaks, and anticipating those dropping, for when the acorns are going to start dropping, and definitely alfalfa and soybeans, apples. That's what I'm keying in on. Mineral sites for sure. I mean, Pennsylvania, you can use mineral, but you have to have it out 30 days before the season starts. It's kind of a hassle. So I just use it in Ohio. In Ohio, it works out real good. So it draws in, a lot of bucks will come to that mineral. You get a lot of good inventory at mineral sites, especially they've been well established. I got a mineral site over on that farm I hunt in Ohio that I have a YouTube channel, Whitetails 24/7, 365. Shameless plug there. But if
No
follow my
problem,
YouTube.
buddy. I've
But,
watched it. I subscribe,
but anyhow,
so you're good.
I have a mineral site over there that's probably 6 to 8 foot around. I mean, it's just torn up. It looks like a puddle of water. It's. But yeah, that it will draw in every deer around for sure, especially if it's close to a bean field.
Now, Mike, we've been talking lately. You're starting to get into the habitat work a little bit, and what kind of approach have you been taking on your own property? How did you get to thinking about putting these food plots in, and why?
Okay, well, like I said, I've had my property logged out a couple times, and years ago, I decided I was going to try and kill off a lot of so I was doing a little habitat improvement. I didn't really realize it at the time, but like a lot of quake and aspen and stuff that was drowning out smaller cherries and oaks and that. I went in and girdled a lot of trees. And I noticed when I had it logged in 2012, the last time it was logged was 2012, and it really got a lot of deer bedding right on the fence line, my property line with my neighbors. He has a real thick pine thicket on his property, and the deer were either bedding in his pines or in my thicket. So I have some apple trees back here on the very back of my property, and I started thinking, well, I can take the kids back there, set up some cameras, and see what's going on in these apples, for early season. And luckily, my son Hunter, when he was 9 in 2017, he shot a buck first couple days of archery with what is it? What the heck are they called? Crossbow. Excuse me. He shot it with the crossbow there, and there was a scrape there. There were some apple trees, and I decided, well, maybe I should be doing some more here to open it up so these apple trees get more sunlight.
Right.
So this year I decided I was going to go in there and I cut down a bunch of trees. So I did like in a 50 yards, maybe more radius around these apple trees. I dropped all these soft maples and I cut them all up, and I took all the branches off of them, and I kind of like made walls to funnel the deer. So they were going to have to walk out where this food plot is. And then I took and I raked up everything there, and I planted clover in there, and it's coming up good now. I got some sort of, I don't know what this weed is that's coming up in it. I cut it actually today to get that down, but that's the one site, and that's basically why I started doing that, was for my kids. My 9-year-old Hunter shot his first buck there in 2017, and then last year Jonathan was 8, and he shot a doe there on the first day of archery where those apple trees are. So I just wanted to improve that spot for the kids. It's right behind the house. It's easy to access. I can go in around off of my neighbor's property. We cut in trails We took a four-wheeler and went up down through there, and we cut in trail so we can walk in the back door. And I got a blind set up for him. So now it's nice because now there's a clover plot there. It's growing nice. And I got the apple trees all opened up. So there should be way more apples this year than there has been in the past. So that should work out real good. And then right here behind my house, I don't have much field. My brother has the field next to me, and he doesn't really want to do anything with it. So I had to do, a small food plot there. And Brian had suggested peas, buckwheat, and clover mix. And I got about a third of an acre that I did with. I just took my rototiller back there. I mowed it. I took my rototiller back there and I tilled it up with my rototiller that I use in my garden. And I planted that stuff before we went to Florida 2 weeks ago. And I came back and it was all up. I mean, I couldn't believe it. And that's one thing I want to mention to any of your guys. You got new listeners or whatever. You asked earlier about why I got into doing food plots, or maybe why if I heard of it when I was younger or whatever. But you feel like you can't do it. It's just like when you watch. Now I don't watch outdoor shows anymore. Nothing against them, but I mean I did. There was a point in my life when I watched them. But when you watch them, all these guys have friggin' full size John Deeres, and they're planting. They're planting 4 zillion acres of food plots. And not that it's wrong, it's just that when you see that, you think to yourself, even though I owned 20 acres of my own land, I thought to myself, there's nothing I can do, because I can't do that. How am I going to do that? But I just this year I just went back there with a chainsaw and a rototiller and a rake and sweat. And, I have 2 food plots that are a third acre, and I've got deer. In fact, I've got a camera on that clover back there by the apple trees, and that scrape, there's bucks coming in and going into that scrape every day. They're going in there. I don't know why, but they happen to be walking through there. Now I know that they're bedded right by there. That definitely helps. They bed within 100 yards of those apple trees, but they're walking through there to go out into the ag fields, and it just happens to be their travel route, and they stop and they I get pictures of them sticking their heads up into that scrape. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, that's 2 great points that you covered there. One, you're not trying to draw the deer somewhere where they don't want to be. It's kind of like turkey hunting.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good spot. The deer like to be there. So that's a good thing for our listeners to take away. If you find a place where the deer like to come through, if you can. Now there's limitations depending on your property, whether it's soil or terrain maybe that you can't do something. But even something as simple as Mike said, get some sunlight to the apple trees, get some sunlight to the ground. Do it where the deer want to be. That way you're not fighting, trying to pull them somewhere where they don't want to go.
Exactly. These deer had been traditionally going through there, so I figured I'd just try to improve it. And I'm hoping that this year it will definitely. I mean, they've 2 years in a row they both shot deer there anyhow. But I'm thinking it's going to be even better. Maybe they can shoot a nicer buck or whatever. I mean, I encourage them to shoot whatever they see, but
No, Mike, I think you had a great point there as well. And probably the other point that Brian meant was, just get out there. And we kind of covered this in the last episode as well, but yeah, I mean, I've been working on my first food plot. I think was on like a 5-acre property. You don't have to have any huge equipment or a huge plot of land. I mean, yeah, it sucks when you don't have a tractor. I mean, I know all about that.
mm-hmm.
Or even before I finally was able to get a 4-wheeler, everything was hand tools. And yeah, like you said, sweat. That's what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
Where there's a will, there's a way. And if you want to improve your habitat or see more deer or wildlife, period, and you want it that bad, you'll get out there and do it. So if there's any questions from all the listeners on how you guys can get started, just shoot us a Facebook message or Mike or Brian or I. I mean, I'm talking to a guy, Aaron, local Michigan guy. He's not thinking he's going to be home in time from being deployed to get his food plots done. It's like I told him I think he does have enough time. So if you're ever unsure, just do a little research or reach out to us or whatever you want. Things can be done. It's not rocket science. These guys that you're talking about, Mike, they just have a lot nicer equipment than most people, except for Brian. Brian's got
Yeah.
pretty nice. But
He
it was a
does
good
have a nice.
point. I
He
wanted to
does
cover
have a
that
nice setup.
point.
Yeah, it took a few years
I know it.
getting there.
I'm waiting
Yeah.
for him to drive that John Deere up to Michigan to help me plant some stuff. That'd be nice.
Anytime, man.
I tell you
I
what, he probably would. He
he
already
probably would.
offered to come and do it on our lease over there. So,
Brian's such a good
I
guy.
might take him
I
up
know he
on
would.
it.
Yeah, I would. I know he would. He's such a good dude. Um, but that was a great point that you guys both were probably going to cover there, and I just wanted to make sure we hit it. So
Yeah, definitely.
okay, now I want to see we are getting a little over an hour here, Mike, and I want to be respectful of your time. Um, kind of gone through everything we wanted to talk about. I'd like to maybe hear that Super Freak story or cover anything else that we have maybe missed that you wanted to make sure we cover.
Well, we covered quite a bit. I mean, the main thing that I'd like to say is, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. There's no right or wrong way to kill a deer, and there's no magic potion. It just anybody can do it. All they have to do is go out and try. You just have to go out there and get your butt walking.
Yep.
and look at the sign and try to ask yourself questions. Why is this here? When are they here? And you can have success too. Now, if you wanted me to talk about that deer, Super Freak. All
I
right,
just like hearing big deer stories. So
okay. Well, that buck.
how big was he?
He was in the 150s, mid
Nice.
150s. When in summer when he was in velvet, he had two drops on his left side. One came down on one side of his left eye, and the other one came down back of his left eye. So he had
Good
two
night.
like 8-inch drop. Yeah, two like 8-inch drops on his left side. Which, man, I was really excited when I seen that. Now the funny thing with that buck is like the first year that I tried to shoot him, and I'd say he was a 3.5-year-old, and he was just like a 4x5, And it was funny because that year his left side was real big, 5 points. His right side was way smaller. And then in the next year, in 2015, his right side had 6 typical points on it, and his left side had 5 typical points on it.
Jeez.
And then in 2016, he was a typical 5x5, but his right side was noticeably smaller than his left side, and his left side had these 2 big long drop tines on it. So, but it was, it was definitely the same buck. I mean, his brow tines were the same all 3 years. I mean, they looked exactly the same. I do have one shed from him from 2015, but yeah, that buck, I never would see him during daylight until late season. I almost killed him in the late season in 2014. When he was a 3.5-year-old, he came out with some other bucks that had already shed into eaten, waste out of a cornfield, And one of the smaller bucks saw me draw the bow back. Thank God, because Owen ended up killing him 2 years later, way bigger. But so I had a lot of history with that deer, but he didn't walk around very much during daylight. And that was another situation where there's a big beaver dam there, and I had put a camera on a trail and that transition, like I was talking about in the beaver dam, where that 40, 50 yards is all like dogwood and just, thick. And he was walking the edge of that in November between like the 6th and the 12th. I had like 3 daylight photos. Now there was a doe that was bedding in this little patch of thicket right on this little feeder creek. And, that's why, I quit shooting does in October years ago, because I found that over time, through trial and error, that if you got a doe or a couple does that are bedding, a lot of times they stay in a small area, and if you got a couple little patches of thicket and there's a doe bedding in there, I mean, just stay out of there until, the right time, and there's a good chance you can shoot a nice buck, especially over in Northeast Ohio where we're hunting at. But so anyway, there was a doe that was bedding off of this feeder creek, and I put up 2 stands down on that transition where that feeder creek was, and one for each, two different winds, one on each side of the trail, basically, that he had walked down the previous year. And I walked down that feeder creek. I got on it. As soon as I got into the woods, I got right off a logging road, and I walked down in there, and I sat there all day long it was almost like it was 6 days out of 7 or whatever it was. And I saw Super Freak almost killed him on the 9th. He came in to get that doe right behind me. And the wind was it was a high pressure day, and the milkweed was floating high. And they came in from behind me, downwind of me, and I wheezed him up to me because he didn't want to leave that doe. And I had seen him. That was the second time I saw him. Third time I saw him. And when he walked out of there, he went to there was a patch of it was like a triangle right on the edge of the property line, and it was maybe 2 acres, and it was just so thick. It's the kind of stuff, and I'd go in there and look for sheds, but you couldn't even barely walk through it. You have to lift branches up so you can get your body underneath them, and that's how thick it was. And he went into that same spot every time I saw him. So I figured, well, I'm gonna have to get over there if I want to kill him, because he's not coming by this tree, for whatever reason. I wheezed him up to me. I almost killed him, but right when I went to draw my bow back, he heard something. He didn't see me. He just jumped, and he was only 10 yards, but it was so thick in there I couldn't get a shot at him. So anyhow, I go back there. I think it was the 14th of November. It was the night of that super moon. So I shot the Super Freak on the night of the super moon. It was kind of cool, but I went in there, and when I walked down in, I brought my stick and stand, my lone wolf stick and sticks and stand, and there was a cherry tree that he had walked by to go into that little thicket right there. So I figured, well, I got to get in that cherry tree. So I got up in that cherry tree, and when I had walked in there, I jumped a couple deer. So I wasn't sure what they were. It was high pressure. Got up in the tree about 45 minutes after I got in. I had worked that night before, and I was supposed to work that night. So I got there late. It was like 2 in the afternoon. My vacation was over now at this point. And I got up in the tree, and I hear this deer snorting to the north. And I'm like, okay, this wind is blowing out of the southwest. There's no way that this deer smells me. And I'm right on the edge of a swamp. So, I'm watching my milkweed float up over the swamp through the cattails. Like, I don't know, what this deer's snorting at. And then it was real quiet. And I hear this deer walking. And here comes this buck that I called the intruder buck. He was a real big 8-point, like a mid 140s.
Jeez.
And he comes down right under the tree that I had hunted all those days previously. He comes right down that trail.
Of course.
And the doe is right on the neighboring property. And I think what happened was when I walked in there, the deer that I spooked was a doe and a fawn. Because what ended up happening was, so that doe's snorting, and she's snorting, and then here comes that buck. And when he walked by and I realized I wasn't going to get a shot, he was like 40 yards, but I don't shoot that far with my bow. I just don't. So, especially, it's when it's thick like that, whatever. But I mean, I tried to call him over. Yeah. So I grunted to him, and I, hit the mute can, and he had nothing to do with it. He started chasing that doe around. I could hear them, chasing around, and I'm watching them. So I hear another deer coming from that direction where the buck had come from, and here it's this little fawn, and this fawn is walking right towards me. She's walking down the edge of the transition, and she's coming from the south, and the chasing is going on right now to my northwest, and the fawn's coming down the transition, and I hear a buck run. And here comes this buck that had been in there for several years. He just didn't have a real big rack. He was like a 130-something inch buck, but I'd been getting pictures of him for several years. He just never got any bigger. I called that buck Intimidator, but he just had this look on his face. He was just a cool-looking buck, but he just didn't have a huge rack. And he's following this doe, and I'm like, okay, I'll shoot him. I don't care, So he's walking straight down the transition right at me, following this fawn. And the whole time I hear this deer walking through the swamp, like in the cattails, in the marsh, in the water. I could hear footsteps. And all the ruckus of this buck chasing this doe. I mean, this all happened within a few minutes, And I could hear this deer coming from straight downwind of me, south, to my northeast. The wind's blowing in the southwest, but like I said, it was floating high. So I'm getting ready for this other 8-point that's walking straight at me. Now the fawn goes right behind me. When she gets behind me, he's like 30 yards behind her, grunting, nose to the ground, walking straight at me. So I'm gonna have to wait for an ankle on this deer. And all of a sudden, when this fawn steps into the cattails on the edge of the marsh, I just hear whoosh, whoosh, all this water splashing and this and that, and then I hear grunting. And next thing I know, here comes Super Freak, chases that fawn right around my tree. She stops out in front of me, and I just, drew back and pivoted my hips and turned, and he was right below me, 6-8 yards, and just, drilled him right through the boiler room. It happened fast, but it was pretty,
Man.
I was so happy, man. Yeah, sometimes it happens like that, But the thing that the whole point of that story when I told you that earlier was that, guys think, as far as being aggressive is, I hear all the time, oh, first time in, first time in's great. But if you can get in there without the deer knowing, it doesn't end it, And I had seen that buck 3 times before that. And, he's not the only deer in the woods, So,
right. I see what you're saying.
Sometimes you got to be aggressive,
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't shoot them sitting on the couch.
You're right. And I think, I don't know, I think you would know, I guess, PA and Michigan, New York, I think you need to be aggressive to kill these bigger deer. But I also think that with a smaller property, you can also be over aggressive very quickly. But so I've been super conservative the last, I don't know, 5 years, and it's paid off, if you will. But I've also, sat and watched. So it's kind of like there's a fine line. I haven't figured out what that line exactly is yet, but I know that maybe when you get those cold fronts or you have a nice rain coming the next day, will wash out your sun away. Maybe it's the time to be aggressive, but I don't know where that line is to try to figure that out.
Yeah, I'm having struggles with being aggressive, not aggressive enough. Don't want to get too aggressive, but I think it's time of year dependent. Like Mike talks about during the rut. Now you can't go in there like a goof. I mean, these big bucks, even though they're distracted, they're not gonna, come in and fall over for you. But I think you can get away with a lot more, and that's something that I'm working on, trying to get more aggressive at the right time.
And also, if you do have the access, that has a lot to do with it. I'm not going to be too aggressive if I don't have, the access that, as dealing with hunting the same area or same stand more than once, if I have good access, then I will be aggressive like that.
Awesome. Well, guys, I think that was another great point. We cover access a ton on this podcast as well. So hopefully a couple of our listeners will, put a few extra nails in the coffin when it comes to a nice big buck this fall. But Mike, I wanted to say thank you one more time for coming on.
No problem. Anytime.
That's great talking to you, man. You're a big buck killer.
Thank you.
I think we needed to have this conversation about 3 years ago, but this is great, man.
No problem.
Go ahead and shamelessly plug your YouTube one more time so listeners can find you.
Okay, it's Whitetails 24/7, 365, and I'm just, I've just started it. I've just been doing it with a cell phone, so it's nothing, ground shaking. I'm just trying to go through, basically put little tidbits up there for guys. A lot of guys know the stuff that I'm saying, but there's always new hunters out there that have questions about things. So I try to cover how I go about throughout the season. I'll be putting stuff out and just giving tips on what to do in certain situations and what I do, what I look for. My setups, I put some of my setups on there. So yeah, hopefully it's helpful to somebody.
Yeah, and hopefully we can send a few more subscribers your way. I know there's a few more whitetail nuts that follow the podcast. So cool. If anybody else wants to reach out to you, can they find you on Facebook or? Yeah,
I'm on Facebook. Just Mike Perry.
Okay.
And
cool,
I answers questions on Messenger. I have people every time I do one of these, asking me questions and stuff like that. So yeah, I help anybody out in any way I can.
Awesome, Mike. Well, thank you so much again for your time. Really do appreciate it, and I wish you the best of luck this fall, my friend. Another episode in the books, everyone. Thank you to the listeners for tuning in once again, and thanks to Mike Perry for coming on the Habitat podcast. Brian, I don't know about you, man, but that got me excited for bow season, which is about 3.5 months away.
Yeah, that'll get the blood flowing. Some good stories about some big bucks and some tactics and some new tips to give a try.
Yeah, some very detailed scouting techniques. Might have to have him on again right before season or something because that was, I mean, you can listen to it again, of course, but I feel
Yeah.
like you're getting out there, you get in the woods, and you start seeing some of this stuff. Might have some questions, so it might be a good time to bring him back on. That was awesome. He's a killer. You go on his Facebook page, he's got tons of big deer on there. But how'd you guys meet? Anyways, you said like an archer club or
Yeah, the United Bow Hunters of Pennsylvania
that was it.
is a large group that has done a lot since 1985 for
Okay.
the bow hunters of Pennsylvania. They've gotten our season extended. They've gotten a bear archery season. Great organization. As you know, I was the editor of their magazine, and then more recently the director of media operations for a while. Mike was, I believe, a regional director and maybe even a county rep at one time. So we knew of each other and talked online, and were familiar with each other through the organization and through some other venues. And then just getting to talking to him, found out once I was up in Ashtabula County, Ohio. Yeah, literally, he's 4 or 5 miles from me, the one farm
Wow.
that he big buck on. And I helped him track a deer one day, and he come over and scouted a couple times. So it's really nice to walk around in the woods with somebody that's been at it that long and to see what they see. And I'm glad he mentioned his YouTube channel because he'll walk you through the spots that he was just talking about. And it's really cool to connect the dots, because a lot of times we listen to this stuff and talk about it, but once we see it, it all comes together.
Yep. Yep. No, that's a great point. It'd be cool to have some videos on your farm with him at some point. I'm sure you'd love to walk around with him again anyways, but
Oh yeah.
I've
Yeah.
been
That's
watching
really
his stuff too on YouTube and full of information. So I
good
appreciate you
stuff.
getting him on here, man.
Yeah. No problem.
Next, let's thank the listeners one more time. Let's thank our sponsors. We have Killer Food Plots, the Habitat Hook, Packer Max Cultipackers, Dip That Hydrographics, and Michigan Whitetail Pursuit. Every one of these companies is out there hammering it hard right now, getting ready for this upcoming fall. And if you guys don't mind, check them out. Tell them the Habitat Podcast sent you. Most of them are offering discounts if you mention the podcast. So if you're new to our podcast, you can find us on habitatpodcast.com, iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, Stitcher, wherever you can get a podcast, we'll be at. We've been doing a lot on Facebook, Instagram, and also YouTube lately. Brian's been kicking butt on YouTube, making a lot of content on his place. So since he's dry enough to get some stuff going, and really,
Finally.
really, yeah, I really appreciate that, man. You have some great stuff putting up there. Um, we're also doing a giveaway on Facebook right now for some Killer Food Plots climatized seed. So be sure to get on our Facebook and find that giveaway. And, once again, just thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll be back next week with another great episode as we become better habitat managers.